The wind howled across the Wyoming plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the kind of cold that could stop a man's heart. It was the winter of 1881, and the town of Cheyenne huddled against the elements as if trying to make itself smaller, less visible to the fury of nature. Caleb Morrison stood on the platform of the Union Pacific Depot, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. He was a tall man, 32 years old, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working the land under an unforgiving sun. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, premature aging from grief and hard living. 2 years had passed since his wife Sarah died, coughing blood into white handkerchiefs, until there was nothing left of her but memory and sorrow. He pulled his coat tighter and scanned the few passengers disembarking from the eastbound train. Most were men, rough types heading west to seek their fortunes or escape their pasts. A family with 3 children struggled with their luggage. An elderly woman accepted help from a porter. And then he saw her. She stepped down from the first-class car with the kind of grace that seemed impossible in such weather. She wore a deep blue traveling dress that must have cost more than Caleb made in 6 months, and her auburn hair was pinned up beneath a fashionable hat trimmed with feathers. Her skin was pale, unblemished by sun or hardship, and even from a distance Caleb could see that her hands were delicate, uncalloused. This could not be his mail-order bride. This could not be the sturdy farm woman the catalog had promised him. She looked around the platform with wide eyes, a mixture of fear and determination crossing her features. When their eyes met, she hesitated, then walked toward him with careful steps, mindful of the ice beneath her expensive boots. "Mr. Morrison," she said. Her voice was cultured, educated, with the crisp accent of Boston high society. "I am Margot Adelaide Bennett. I believe you are expecting me." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. The catalog had described a woman of 26 years, experienced in household management, seeking a practical arrangement in the Wyoming Territory. It had not mentioned anything about aristocratic bearing or the kind of beauty that made a man forget his own name. "Ma'am," he said finally, his voice rough from disuse. He had not spoken to many people in the 2 years since Sarah's death. "I think there has been some mistake. The woman I sent for was supposed to be," he paused, searching for diplomatic words more suited to ranch life. A flicker of panic crossed Margot's face, quickly suppressed. She lifted her chin, and Caleb recognized the gesture. It was the look of someone who had nowhere else to go and was determined not to show weakness. "I assure you, Mr. Morrison, I am quite capable of learning whatever is required." The catalog agency in Denver confirmed our arrangement. "I have traveled 2,000 miles to be here. Surely you will not send me back on the very same train." Snow began to fall, soft flakes that melted on Margot's shoulders. She did not have a proper winter coat, Caleb noticed, just a thin wool cape that was completely inadequate for Wyoming weather. Whatever her story was, whatever had driven a Boston socialite to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, she was here now, and the temperature was dropping fast. He made a decision, one he hoped he would not regret. "Come on, then," he said, reaching for her single trunk. "The wagon is this way. We have about an hour's ride to the ranch. You had better prepare yourself. It is going to be colder than you have ever experienced." She followed him without complaint, though he could see her shivering. As he loaded her trunk onto his wagon, he noticed how she looked around the rough frontier town with barely concealed alarm. Cheyenne was not Boston. There were no paved streets here, no gas lamps or fine carriages, just mud and wood and the constant battle against nature. The ride to Ironwood Ranch was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Margot sat beside him, rigid with cold and something else. Fear, perhaps, or regret. Caleb found himself stealing glances at her profile, trying to reconcile the elegant woman beside him with the practical helpmate he had hoped to find. "Tell me about your daughter," Margot said suddenly, breaking the silence. "The agency mentioned You are a widower with a child." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Lily. She is 5 years old. She does not remember her mother much, though we keep Sarah's photograph on the mantel." He paused. "She is not easy with strangers. You should know that." "I understand," Margot replied softly. "Loss leaves its mark on all of us, especially children." There was something in her voice that made Caleb look at her more carefully. This was not just a woman seeking adventure or escaping boredom. This was someone running from something, carrying her own weight of loss and fear. The ranch came into view as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered fields in shades of orange and gold. The main house was a 2-story structure built of sturdy timber, with smoke rising from the chimney. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, and a few cattle could be seen in the near pasture, their dark shapes stark against the white landscape. "It is not much," Caleb said, suddenly self-conscious about his modest holdings, "but it is honest work and good land." "It is beautiful," Margot said, and she sounded like she meant it. "I have never seen so much open space." As they approached the house, the front door opened and a woman emerged. She was in her 60s, with steel-gray hair and the dignified bearing of someone who had survived much and expected to survive more. This was Ida Finch, the housekeeper who had been with Caleb since he bought the ranch 4 years ago. She had been born a slave in Missouri, freed by the war, and had traveled west, seeking a new life. She ran Caleb's household with quiet efficiency and had been more of a mother to Lily than anyone since Sarah's death. "So this is the bride," Ida said, her dark eyes taking in every detail of Margot's appearance. Her tone was neutral, but Caleb heard the skepticism underneath. "You look half frozen, child. Come inside before you catch your death." A small figure appeared behind Ida in the doorway. Lily Morrison was a delicate child with her mother's blonde hair and her father's serious brown eyes. She wore a simple dress and had one finger in her mouth, a habit she had developed since Sarah died. She stared at Margot with open suspicion. "Lily," Caleb said gently, coming to lift his daughter into his arms. "This is Miss Bennett. She is going to be staying with us." The child said nothing, just buried her face in her father's shoulder. That evening, after a simple supper of stew and bread, Caleb showed Margot to the spare bedroom upstairs. It was clean but sparse, with a single bed, a washstand, and a small dresser. Nothing like the luxury she was clearly accustomed to. "We will talk tomorrow about the arrangement," he said, standing awkwardly in the doorway. "About expectations and such. For tonight, just rest. You have had a long journey." Margot nodded, but as he turned to leave, she spoke. "Mr. Morrison, thank you for not sending me back on that train. I know I am not what you expected, but I promise you I am stronger than I look." He studied her for a moment, this elegant stranger who had appeared in his life like a figure from a dream. "We will see," he said. "Wyoming has a way of testing people. Good night, Miss Bennett." After he left, Margot sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself, for the first time since leaving Boston, to truly feel the weight of her situation. She was 2,000 miles from home, in a harsh land she did not understand, married or about to be married to a man who clearly did not want her. She thought about her father, Thomas Bennett, dead 6 months now from a heart attack brought on by stress and shame. She thought about the debts he had left behind, debts to a man named Vincent Blackwell, who made his fortune lending money to desperate people at impossible rates. She thought about Blackwell's son, Vincent Jr., with his cold eyes and his assumption that she was property to be collected along with the other assets. From her small bag she pulled a wooden box about the size of a book, locked with a brass clasp. Inside were documents that could destroy the Blackwell empire if they ever saw daylight. Her father's ledgers, meticulous records of every transaction, every illegal interest rate, every threat made when payments were late. And most importantly, the forged contract that claimed to sell Margot herself to Vincent Jr. as payment for debt. She had stolen these papers the night before she fled Boston, knowing they were her only insurance. If the Blackwells found her, if they tried to force her back, She could threaten to expose everything. But it was a dangerous game. The Blackwells were powerful, connected, ruthless. Her father had tried to fight them, and it had killed him. A soft knock on the door startled her. She quickly hid the box under the bed. "Come in." The door opened to reveal Lily, still in her nightgown, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. She stood in the doorway, one small hand gripping the frame. "Did you know my mama?" the child asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Margot's heart ached at the directness of the question. "No, sweetheart, I did not. But I am sure she was wonderful if she was anything like you. Papa says she was an angel." Lily's eyes were solemn, measuring. "Are you going to try to be my new mama?" Margot chose her words carefully. "I would never try to replace your mama. No one could do that. But I hope we can be friends, you and I." Lily considered this for a long moment, then nodded once, a small gesture of tentative acceptance. "Good night, Miss Bennett. Good night, Lily." After the child left, Margot lay back on the bed, still fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. She had no idea how to run a ranch house, no idea how to cook for working men or tend to cattle, or any of the 100 other things expected of a frontier wife. In Boston, she had managed servants and attended social functions and played the piano. None of those skills seemed particularly useful here, but she had not survived her father's death, Blackwell's threats, and a 2,000-mile journey just to fail now. She would learn. She had to. The first true test came the next morning when Ida, with barely concealed amusement, asked Margot to help with breakfast. "The ranch hands will be here at dawn," Ida explained, gesturing to the massive iron stove that dominated the kitchen. "They will expect hot food, bacon, eggs, biscuits, and coffee strong enough to strip paint. You know how to work a stove, I suppose?" Margot stared at the intimidating contraption. In Boston, she had never even entered the kitchen unless it was to give instructions to the cook. Of course, she lied. 20 minutes later, the kitchen was filled with smoke. The bacon was burned, the eggs were somehow both undercooked and overcooked at the same time, and the biscuits had emerged from the oven, some as hard as stones. Caleb, attracted by the smell of disaster, appeared in the doorway and took in the scene with raised eyebrows. "I think perhaps Miss Bennett needs some instruction," Ida said diplomatically, waving smoke away from her face. Margot stood amid the wreckage of her first attempt at frontier domesticity, her face flushed with embarrassment and her expensive dress stained with grease. "I am sorry," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "In Boston, I never had to cook. We had people for that." Caleb said nothing for a moment, and Margot braced herself for anger or mockery. Instead, he surprised her. "Everyone has to start somewhere," he said. "Even Ida burned her first batch of biscuits when she came here. The ranch hands can eat at Josiah's place in town this morning. Tomorrow you can try again." The days that followed were a series of small humiliations and hard-earned lessons. Margot learned that milking a cow required strength and rhythm she did not possess. She learned that chickens were mean-spirited creatures that attacked without provocation. She learned that carrying water from the well in winter meant frozen fingers and aching shoulders. She learned that keeping a fire going required constant attention, and that laundry in Wyoming was nothing like sending delicate things to a professional laundress in Boston. More than once, she found herself alone in the barn, tears of frustration freezing on her cheeks, wondering what madness had brought her to this place. But each time, she thought about the alternative, Vincent Jr.'s hands on her, his assumption of ownership, the slow death of her spirit that would come from being trapped in Boston with no money, no family, no options. This was hard, but it was her choice, and that made all the difference. Lily watched everything with those solemn brown eyes, saying little but missing nothing. She did not warm to Margot, but neither did she actively oppose her presence. It was a cold truce, and Margot accepted it as the best she could hope for. 2 weeks after her arrival, on a particularly bitter afternoon, Margot was in the stable attempting to brush down one of the horses. The animal, A large gelding named Thunder was not cooperating. He kept dancing away from her awkward attempts, clearly sensing her fear and inexperience. "You have to show him you are not afraid," a small voice said. Margot turned to find Lily standing in the stable doorway. The child walked forward with the confidence of someone who had grown up around animals. "Here, like this." Lily demonstrated the proper technique, her small hands moving with practiced ease. The horse immediately calmed under her touch. Margot watched, then tried to imitate the movements. It still was not quite right, but Thunder tolerated it. "Thank you," Margot said softly. Lily nodded, then hesitated. "Miss Bennett, why did you come here? Really, Papa thinks you are running from something." Margot considered lying, then decided the child deserved honesty, or at least as much as she could safely give. "You are very perceptive, Lily." "Yes, I am running from something, from someone who wanted to control my life. Coming here was my way of choosing my own path." "Is he going to find you?" The directness of the question took Margot's breath away. "I hope not. But if he does, your father has promised to help me, and I promise that I will never bring danger to you intentionally." Lily studied her for a long moment, with eyes far too old for her 5 years. "I believe you," she said finally. Then, in a gesture that made Margot's throat tight, the little girl reached out and took her hand. "Come on, I will show you how to feed the chickens without getting pecked." That afternoon, as Margot followed Lily around the ranch, listening to the child's explanations of how things worked, she felt something shift inside her. This place, these people, they were becoming real to her in a way Boston society never had. The work was hard, the conditions harsh, but there was an honesty to it that she had never experienced before. That night, Caleb found her sitting on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in one of Sarah's old quilts, and staring out at the star-filled sky. "You will freeze out here," he said, but he sat down beside her anyway. "I needed air, and I have never seen so many stars. In Boston, there are too many lights." They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, then Caleb spoke. "Lily told me you two spent the afternoon together. That is the most she has talked about anyone since Sarah died. She is a remarkable child. You have done well with her, alone. I had help. Ida, mostly." He paused. "I know this is not what you expected, Miss Bennett. This life. I am sorry about that." Margot turned to look at him. His profile was strong in the starlight, and she realized that despite the hardship, despite the constant feeling of inadequacy, she was not unhappy here. "Please, call me Margot. And as for expectations, nothing in my life has turned out as expected. At least here, I am choosing my own path." "Are you?" he asked quietly. "Or are you just running?" "Both," she admitted. "Can it not be both?" Before Caleb could respond, a sound cut through the night, the thunder of approaching horses moving fast. Caleb was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to the rifle that stood by the door. Margot stood as well, her heart suddenly racing. "Get inside," Caleb ordered, his voice sharp. "Now." But she did not move, frozen by a fear that went deeper than cold. Because she recognized that sound. It was the sound of pursuit, the sound of men who rode with purpose. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, pulling their horses to a stop at the edge of the property. They were rough-looking men, dressed for travel, with the kind of hard eyes that spoke of violence as a profession. The leader, a man with a scarred face and a black beard, looked directly at the porch. "Evening," he called out, his voice carrying across the frozen yard. "We are looking for someone. A woman from Boston. Auburn hair, educated voice, fine clothes. We know she bought a ticket on the Union Pacific, got off at Cheyenne about 3 weeks back. Been riding to every ranch and homestead within 30 miles, asking around. Figured if a woman like that showed up in these parts, somebody would have noticed. You folks see anyone matching that description?" Caleb's grip on the rifle tightened. "This is private property. You have no business here." The bearded man smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Now, that is not very neighborly. We are just asking questions. See, this woman, she stole something that does not belong to her. The man who owns it wants it back. He is willing to pay good money for information." "There is no one here but my family," Caleb said firmly. "Now move along before I decide you are trespassing with intent." The three men exchanged glances. The leader shrugged. "Fair enough. But if you do happen to see a woman matching that description, you let us know. We will be in Cheyenne for a few more days. Name's Garrett. Anyone at the Silver Dollar Saloon can point you our way." They turned their horses and rode off into the darkness, but the threat lingered in the air like smoke. Caleb waited until they were well gone before turning to Margot. She stood in the doorway, her face pale in the lamplight, and he could see her trembling. Not from cold this time, from fear. Inside, he said quietly, "Now we talk." In the warmth of the parlor, with Ida having taken Lily upstairs and promised to keep the child away, Margot told Caleb everything. She told him about her father's desperation and poor business decisions. She told him about Vincent Blackwell, the moneylender who trapped people in debt they could never escape. She told him about the ledgers that documented everything, the forged contract claiming her as property, and, most importantly, the small silver mine in Colorado that her father had left her, the one asset the Blackwells wanted desperately to control. "So you are not really running from an arranged marriage," Caleb said when she finished. "You are running from criminals who see you as a way to steal a mine. The mine is worth perhaps $200,000, Margot said, her voice steady despite her fear. "Maybe more. My father found it years ago, kept it secret, and left it to me in a will that is legally binding. But the Blackwells have lawyers, judges, politicians in their pocket. If they catch me in Boston, they will find a way to take it. The only way I can protect myself is with those ledgers. They are my insurance. If the Blackwells try to force me, I threaten to expose them. But now they have sent hunters," Caleb finished, "and those men will not give up easily." He stood and paced the room, his mind working through the problem. He could send her back. It would be the safe choice, the sensible choice. He had Lily to think about, the ranch to protect. Getting involved in a war with Boston criminals was not something a rational man would do. But then he looked at Margot, sitting straight-backed in Sarah's favorite chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes showing fear but also determination. She had not asked for this. She had tried to do the right thing, to protect herself, and now she was hunted like an animal. He remembered something his wife had said to him once, after they had taken in an injured wolf cub that most people would have shot on sight. She had nursed it back to health and released it into the wild. Caleb had asked her why she bothered with something so dangerous. Sarah had looked at him with those gentle eyes and said, "Because protecting those who cannot protect themselves is what makes us human. If we stop doing that, we are no better than the wolves ourselves." Sarah had been talking about an animal then, but the principle held true. "Here is what we are going to do," Caleb said, his decision made. "First, we are not telling anyone in town about this. The fewer people who know your real situation, the better. Second, you are learning to defend yourself. I will teach you to shoot, to ride properly, to handle yourself if things go bad. Third, you are staying here as my wife." Margot's eyes widened. "But we are not married, not yet." "But we will be if you are willing. A legal marriage will give you more protection. They cannot claim you are stolen property if you are my wife by law, and it will give me legal standing to defend you." He paused. "This is not a romantic proposal, Miss Bennett. This is a practical arrangement for mutual benefit. You need protection. Lily needs a mother figure, even if she does not know it yet. I need someone to help run this ranch. It can work if we are both honest about what it is." "And what is it?" Margot asked softly. "A partnership, a safe harbor, maybe in time more than that. But for now, survival." Margot stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness where danger lurked. She thought about her options, which were few. She thought about Lily's hand in hers that afternoon. She thought about the stars over Wyoming and the feeling of choosing her own path. "All right," she said, turning back to face him. "I accept. When do we do this?" "Tomorrow. We will ride into Cheyenne, find Judge Patterson, and make it legal. Then we come back here and prepare, because those men will be back, Margot. And next time, they will not just be asking questions." That night, Margot lay awake in the dark, listening to the wind howl around the house. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Caleb Morrison, not out of love, not even out of desire, but out of necessity. It was not the future she had imagined for herself back in Boston, attending balls and theater performances and living the genteel life of a young woman of breeding. But that future had died with her father. This was her reality now, a rough land, a practical man, a wounded child who needed healing, and enemies who would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was theirs. She thought about the wooden box hidden beneath her bed, filled with the evidence that could destroy the Blackwells, but also put everyone in this house at risk. She thought about Caleb's steady eyes and quiet strength. She thought about Lily's small hand in hers, and she made a promise to herself. She would learn, she would adapt, she would become strong enough to face whatever came, because for the first time in her life she had something worth fighting for. Not money or status or social position, but something more fundamental. She had a choice, and she had people who, against all odds, were beginning to matter to her. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Caleb hitched up the wagon while Margot dressed in her finest remaining dress, a deep green silk that seemed absurdly formal for a frontier marriage. Ida pressed a small bouquet of dried flowers into her hands. "These were Sarah's," the older woman said quietly. "She would want you to have them. You are doing a good thing here, child. For Caleb, for Lily. Do not doubt that." Lily watched from the porch, her expression unreadable. As Margot climbed into the wagon, the little girl ran forward and pressed something into her hand. A small carved horse, worn smooth from being carried in a child's pocket. "For luck," Lily whispered, then ran back inside before Margot could respond. The ride to Cheyenne was quiet. Caleb seemed lost in thought, perhaps regretting his impulsive decision. Margot clutched the carved horse and the dried flowers and tried not to think about how strange it all was. Judge Patterson was a kindly man in his 70s who asked no questions when Caleb requested a marriage ceremony. He had seen enough frontier desperation to know that people had their reasons, and it was not his place to judge. The ceremony took 5 minutes. Caleb's voice was steady as he spoke the vows. Margot's hands shook. When it was done, Judge Patterson smiled. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Morrison." Caleb looked at Margot, and for a moment something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but a recognition, an acknowledgement that they were bound together now, for better or worse. He leaned forward and kissed her gently, briefly, more a promise than a passion. "Congratulations," the judge said. "May you find happiness together." As they walked out of the courthouse, now legally husband and wife, Margot felt the weight of the moment. She had left Boston to escape one form of ownership. Had she just traded it for another? Or had she found something different, something that might, against all odds, become real? They were halfway home when Caleb suddenly pulled the wagon to a stop. 3 riders blocked the road ahead, the same 3 from the night before, led by the scarred man named Garrett. Caleb's hand moved to the rifle beside him, but Garrett raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "Easy now. We are not looking for trouble. Just heard you got married today. Congratulations." His eyes moved to Margot. "Pretty bride you got there. Very pretty. Auburn hair and all." "This is my wife," Caleb said, his voice hard. "And you are in our way." "Funny thing," Garrett continued, as if Caleb had not spoken. "We heard that the woman we are looking for might have answered a mail-order bride advertisement, might have come west to disappear. And here you are, just married to a woman who fits the description exactly." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Margot felt her heart racing, but she kept her face composed. She had not survived this long by showing fear. "I do not know what woman you are looking for," she said, her voice steady. "But I am from Denver, not Boston. And as my husband said, you are in our way." Garrett studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "Denver. Right. Well, pardon our mistake, ma'am. We will just be moving along then." But as the three riders passed the wagon, Garrett leaned close enough that only Margot could hear his whispered words. "Vincent Jr. sends his regards. He says you cannot hide forever." Then they were gone, disappearing down the road toward Cheyenne, leaving Caleb and Margot alone in the frozen silence. Margot realized she was gripping the edge of the wagon seat so hard her knuckles were white. Beside her, Caleb sat very still, his jaw tight. "They know," she whispered. "Yes," he replied. "They know, which means we have very little time." "Time for what?" "To prepare, because they will be back, Margot. And next time, they will not just talk." He looked at her, his brown eyes serious. "Are you ready for what is coming?" Margot thought about everything she had lost, her father, her home, her entire world. She thought about what she had gained, a child who was beginning to trust her, a man who had chosen to protect her when he did not have to, a chance at a life that was her own. "I am ready," she said. "Teach me what I need to know." As they drove toward Ironwood Ranch, the sun setting behind them in shades of gold and crimson, Margot understood that this was just the beginning. The storm was coming, but for the first time in her life, she was not facing it alone. And somehow, that made all the difference. The weeks following the wedding were a study in transformation. Every morning before dawn, while the stars still burned cold and bright above the Wyoming plains, Caleb woke Margot and took her to the barn. There, in the frozen darkness, lit only by a single lantern, he taught her to shoot. The rifle was heavy in her hands at first, the polished wood cold against her cheek, the iron sights swimming in her vision. The first time she fired, the recoil nearly knocked her backward, the explosion deafening in the confined space. Her shoulder bloomed with pain, a bruise that would darken to purple by evening. But she did not complain. She had learned that complaining changed nothing in Wyoming. So instead she listened as Caleb adjusted her stance, his hands impersonal but firm on her shoulders, positioning her body the way a sculptor might position clay. "You are thinking too much," he said one morning as she missed her fifth shot in a row, the bullet going wide and embedding itself in the barn wall. "This is not like playing piano or doing arithmetic. Your body has to know what to do without your mind getting in the way." He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air. "Breathe in, hold it, breathe out halfway. Squeeze the trigger on the empty, not the breath. Your heartbeat will throw off your aim if you're not careful." She tried again, focusing on the rhythm of her breathing, the steady thump of her heart. This time, the bullet struck true, sending splinters flying from the center of the makeshift target. The satisfaction that flooded through her was unexpected and fierce, almost primal. Again, Caleb said, "Until you can do it 10 times without thinking. Until your body remembers even when your mind forgets." The riding lessons were harder still. Margot had ridden in Boston, of course, but that had been side saddle in carefully manicured parks, a groom always nearby, the horses gentle and well-trained. Western riding was something altogether different. It required strength she did not possess, balance she had never needed, and a kind of trust between horse and rider that felt almost mystical. Thunder, the big gelding that had frightened her that first day, became her unwilling teacher. Caleb put her on his back every afternoon, sometimes with a saddle, sometimes without, forcing her to find her seat through feel rather than equipment. She fell more times than she could count, landing hard in the frozen dirt, the impact driving the air from her lungs and leaving her gasping. But each time Caleb was there, his hand extended, his expression showing neither pity nor impatience. Just the quiet expectation that she would get back on. And so she did. Lily watched these lessons with increasing interest. her skepticism slowly giving way to something that looked almost like respect. The child would perch on the fence rail, her small legs dangling, her solemn eyes following every movement. One afternoon, after Margot had taken a particularly hard fall, actually sliding off Thunder's back and landing flat on her backside in a way that would have been humiliating if anyone had laughed, Lily climbed down from the fence and walked over. Without a word, she pressed a cup of hot cider into Margot's cold hands. The gesture was small, but it felt monumental. "Mama used to fall off too," Lily said quietly, her eyes on the ground rather than on Margot's face, "when she was learning. Papa says everybody does. He says the only people who never fall are the ones who never try." It was the first time the child had mentioned her mother to Margot without hostility or grief making her voice sharp. And it felt like a door opening, just a crack, but enough to let light through. "Thank you," Margot said, and she meant it for more than just the cider. The household skills came more slowly, each small victory hard-won. Ida Finch was patient but exacting, a teacher who believed that if something was worth doing, it was worth doing correctly. She showed Margot how to work the massive iron stove without burning everything, how to judge temperature by the heat against her face, how to time bread baking by smell rather than clock. She taught her to make biscuits that did not require a hammer to break open, to fry bacon without setting the kitchen on fire, to brew coffee strong enough to satisfy working men without making it so bitter it could strip paint. Every lesson was a small humiliation followed by gradual improvement. Margot's hands, once soft and useless, developed calluses and burns and small scars. The transformation was written on her skin. At night she fell into bed exhausted, her muscles screaming protest, her mind too tired for the fear that had once kept her awake. But even in sleep she was aware of Caleb moving through the house, checking locks, looking out windows, standing guard against threats she could not see but knew were gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. He slept in his own room, maintaining the fiction that theirs was a real marriage, while respecting the truth that it remained one of convenience. Sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, Margot would wake to hear his footsteps in the hallway, slow and measured, the sound of a man who had learned in war that vigilance was the price of survival. After 6 weeks of relentless training, January gave way to February, and with the turning of the calendar came an announcement that would change everything. The town of Cheyenne was holding its annual Valentine's Dance at the Frontier Hall, a celebration designed to break the monotony of winter and bring the scattered community together for a few hours of music and light. Caleb had no interest in attending. He was not a social man, had never been comfortable in crowds even before Sarah's death made him retreat further into solitude. But Ida Finch had other ideas, and when Ida made up her mind about something, arguing was generally useless. "People need to see her as your wife," the older woman said firmly one evening, her arms crossed over her chest in a way that meant the discussion was not really a discussion at all. "Right now, she is just a stranger who showed up and moved into your house. Folks are talking. They are wondering. And if those men from Boston come asking questions, people need to have a reason to protect her. They need to feel like she belongs here, like she is one of us." Caleb knew she was right. In a frontier community, belonging was everything. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion, their loyalties questioned, their presence tolerated but not embraced. If the community saw Margot as his wife, truly his wife, they might stand with him when trouble came. If they saw her as a kept woman or a fugitive, they would step aside and let nature take its course. So, on the evening of February 14th, as the sun set in shades of rose and gold across the snow-covered plains, Caleb helped Margot into the wagon. Both of them were dressed in their finest. She wore a gown of deep burgundy silk, one of the few nice things she had brought from Boston, the color rich against her pale skin. Ida had helped her arrange her auburn hair in a style that was elegant but not ostentatious, the kind of style that said rancher's wife rather than society belle. Caleb wore a suit that had belonged to his father, dark wool that made his shoulders look even broader and emphasized the gray at his temples. He looked uncomfortable in the formal clothing, kept tugging at his collar as if it were choking him, but Margot thought he looked handsome, distinguished, like a man who had earned his place in the world through hard work rather than inheritance. Lily watched them leave from the porch, wrapped in a quilt beside Ida. The little girl had wanted to come, had begged with tears in her eyes, but the dance was for adults and would run late into the night. So she stood there in the gathering darkness, small and solemn, and called out as the wagon began to move. "Be careful, Papa." There was something in her voice, a note of fear that the child could not quite hide, that made Margot's chest tighten. Lily understood, even without being told in explicit terms, that danger was never far away, that the men who had come looking for Margot once would come again, that the fragile peace they had built could shatter at any moment. "I will," Caleb called back, and then, more softly, to Margot, "I promise." The frontier hall was bright with lanterns when they arrived, light spilling out into the cold darkness, the sound of fiddle music dancing on the frozen air. The building itself was nothing fancy, just a large wooden structure with a raised platform at one end for musicians and a pot-bellied stove at the other to fight back the cold. But tonight it had been transformed. Paper decorations hung from the rafters, red hearts cut from colored paper by the school children. Tables lined the walls, laden with food that the women had brought, each dish a small masterpiece of frontier cooking. Inside, the room was packed with ranchers and townspeople, all dressed in their best, all determined to forget winter's hardships for a few hours. The women gathered in clusters near the refreshment table, their voices rising and falling in waves of gossip and laughter. The men stood closer to the door, talking about cattle prices and spring planting, their hands wrapped around cups of punch that someone had spiked with whiskey when the church ladies were not looking. When Caleb and Margot entered, the room did not fall completely silent, but there was a noticeable pause in conversation. Eyes turned toward them, assessing, measuring, judging. Everyone knew about the hasty wedding. In a town this small, secrets were impossible to keep. And small communities thrived on speculation, on filling in the gaps of unknown stories with imagination and assumption. Was she pregnant? That was the most common theory, whispered behind hands and knowing looks. Was he desperate for any woman who would take on a child not her own? Was she running from something, someone? What secrets was this elegant stranger hiding behind her refined manners and expensive dress? But Caleb walked through the room with his hand firmly at Margot's back, his touch possessive but not aggressive, protective without being defensive. He introduced her to neighbors with a quiet pride that surprised even him. "This is my wife, Margot. She is from Denver originally, came west looking for a different kind of life. We are very happy together." The lie came more easily each time he told it, and Margot found herself playing along with growing confidence. She smiled and nodded and made appropriate comments about the weather and the food and how welcoming everyone had been. Some of the women warmed to her, asking about her dress and where she had learned to sew so fine, and what she thought about various household matters that apparently divided the community into passionate camps. Others remained cold, their smiles brittle, their eyes hard with jealousy or suspicion. These were the unmarried women and the young widows who had set their caps for Caleb Morrison, who had brought him pies and offered to help with Lily, only to be politely but firmly rebuffed. They looked at Margot and saw an interloper, a woman who had somehow claimed the prize they had been circling for 2 years. The men were worse in their own way. Margot could feel their eyes on her as she moved through the room, assessing, measuring, undressing her with their gazes. Some were simply curious, never having seen anyone quite like her in Cheyenne before. Others were bolder, making comments that skirted the edge of propriety, earning warning glares from Caleb that they mostly ignored. The most persistent was Sheriff James Harrington, A man in his early 40s with sandy hair going gray at the temples and an easy smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He had been trying to court several of the local widows without success, his reputation as a hard drinker and harder fighter working against him. Now he turned his attention to Margot with the kind of confidence that came from wearing a badge and carrying a gun. "Mrs. Morrison," he said, appearing at her elbow just as Caleb was pulled into conversation with another rancher about some dispute over water rights. "I was hoping you might honor me with a dance. Your husband will not mind, I am sure. It is tradition for the sheriff to dance with all the new ladies in town." Caleb turned at the sound of Harrington's voice, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His eyes met Margot's, and she could read the warning there as clearly as if he had spoken it aloud. "Be careful, trust no one, give nothing away." "Of course, Sheriff," Caleb said, his tone carefully neutral. "My wife would be delighted." But his hand on Margot's back tightened briefly before releasing her, a silent promise that he was watching, that he would intervene if needed. Margot allowed Harrington to lead her onto the dance floor as the fiddle player struck up a waltz. The sheriff was a competent dancer, she had to give him that. He held her at the proper distance, his steps assured, his movements practiced. But there was something in the way he looked at her, a calculated assessment in his eyes that made her skin crawl. "You are quite the mystery, Mrs. Morrison," he said as they turned across the floor, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "A woman of obvious breeding and education, refined manners and expensive tastes, married to a simple rancher. One wonders what brought you to such a match." "Love?" Margot replied smoothly, the lie coming easily now after weeks of practice, "and a desire for a different kind of life than the one I was living." "In Denver, was it?" The question was casual, but Margot heard the trap underneath it. She met his eyes directly, her expression open and guileless. "Yes, Denver. Perhaps you know it." "Oh, I know Denver well." Harrington spun her expertly, pulling her slightly closer than was strictly proper. "Worked there for several years before taking this position, rose through the ranks. Attended quite a few social functions in my time there, mixing with the better class of people. Funny thing, though, I do not recall ever seeing anyone quite like you in Denver society. And I would have remembered. A woman like you stands out." Margot felt ice forming in her stomach, but kept her expression pleasant, her smile firmly in place. "It is a large city, Sheriff. I am sure our paths simply never crossed. I kept mostly to myself after my father passed. Grief is not very social, perhaps." He studied her face with eyes that missed nothing. "Or perhaps you are from somewhere else entirely. Boston, maybe? I hear Boston has quite the society, quite the old families, quite the scandals, too, from time to time." The music ended, and Margot stepped back immediately, putting distance between herself and the sheriff. Her heart was racing, but she kept her breathing steady, her expression calm. "Thank you for the dance, Sheriff Harrington. But I see my husband looking for me, and I should return to his side." She walked away before he could respond, moving through the crowd with purpose but not panic. When she reached Caleb, she leaned close and whispered urgently in his ear, her lips barely moving. "We need to leave. He knows something, or suspects. Either way, we are not safe here." But before Caleb could respond, before he could make excuses and guide her toward the door, a commotion erupted near the entrance. The music stuttered to a halt. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every head turned toward the source of the disturbance. A man had stumbled in from the cold, his face flushed with drink, his clothes disheveled, his hat missing. He swayed on his feet, grabbing the doorframe for support, his eyes unfocused but searching. It took Margot a moment to recognize him through the haze of alcohol, but when she did, her blood turned to ice. It was one of the 3 riders who had confronted them on the road weeks ago. Not Garrett, the leader with the scarred face, but one of his companions. A younger man with a weak chin and mean eyes who had looked at Margot with undisguised hunger that day. "Looking for someone," the drunk man announced to the room, his words slurred but still audible in the sudden silence. "Woman from Boston, real pretty lady with auburn hair, goes by different names, but she is here somewhere. I can smell her perfume. There is good money in it for anyone who knows where she is, real good money." The silence that followed was absolute. Margot could hear her own heartbeat, could feel every eye in the room turning toward her, could sense the shift in atmosphere from celebration to suspicion. She stood frozen, unable to move, unable to breathe, as the weight of judgment pressed down on her from all sides. Caleb moved instantly, positioning himself between Margot and the crowd, his body a shield, his hand resting on the grip of the revolver he wore at his hip. "This man is drunk and talking nonsense. Sheriff, I suggest you remove him before he disturbs the dance further and upsets the ladies." But Harrington was looking at Margot with new interest, his eyes sharp and calculating, the easy smile gone from his face. "Seems like an odd coincidence, Morrison. Your wife fits that description pretty well. Auburn hair, Boston. Pretty as a picture, makes a man wonder. My wife is from Denver, as I have said repeatedly." Caleb's voice was hard now, the pleasant veneer stripped away, revealing the steel underneath. "And I do not appreciate you questioning her honor or mine based on the ravings of a drunk who probably cannot even remember his own name." The tension in the room was suffocating, thick enough to choke on. The drunk man was being helped toward the door by two townsmen, still muttering about Boston and money and pretty women, but the damage was done. The seed of doubt had been planted. Whispers spread like wildfire through the gathered crowd. "Boston," they said. "Criminal. Liar. What is she running from? What did she do? Why would she come here unless she had no choice? Maybe those men have a legitimate claim. Maybe Morrison is harboring a fugitive. Maybe we should not get involved." Margot felt the community pulling away from her, felt the fragile acceptance she had been building crumble like sand. These people did not know her. They had no reason to trust her. And when forced to choose between a stranger and the safety of their own families, the choice was obvious. Then a voice cut through the noise, clear and authoritative and utterly unexpected. A woman's voice, cultured and confident, with the kind of tone that demanded attention. I can vouch for Mrs. Morrison's character completely. Everyone turned to see who had spoken. Near the refreshment table stood a woman Margot had noticed earlier but had not been introduced to. She was perhaps 30 years old, with intelligent dark eyes and strong features that were handsome rather than pretty. Her dress was simple but well made, dark blue wool with minimal decoration, and her hair was pinned up in a practical style that suggested she had more important things to worry about than fashion. There was something about her bearing, a confidence and competence that commanded respect. She met the room's collective gaze without flinching, without hesitation. "And who might you be?" Harrington asked, his tone skeptical but curious. "Clara Whitmore. I recently moved to Cheyenne from Denver to take the position as school teacher. The previous teacher, as you know, left rather suddenly last month to return to her family in Illinois. I knew Mrs. Morrison and her family there. Her reputation is impeccable, and I resent the implication that she is anything other than what she claims to be. It was a complete fabrication, every word of it a lie. And Margot had absolutely no idea why this stranger was risking herself to protect someone she had never met. But Clara Whitmore met her eyes across the crowded room with a look that communicated volumes. "Trust me, play along. I am here to help." Margot found herself nodding, her mind racing, but her expression carefully controlled. "Yes, of course, Miss Whitmore. How wonderful to see you again. I had no idea you had moved to Cheyenne." What a pleasant surprise. The tension in the room eased slightly, like a breath being released. A school teacher's word carried significant weight in a frontier community. These were people who valued education, who saw teachers as pillars of civilization in a wild land. If the school teacher vouched for someone, that meant something. It gave people permission to believe, to set aside their doubts and return to the celebration. The conversations resumed, the musicians struck up another tune, and the moment passed. But Margot knew it was only a temporary reprieve. The questions remained. The suspicions lingered. And the drunk man's words had been heard by everyone. Caleb seized the moment of distraction. "We will be leaving now," he announced to no one in particular. "My wife is tired, and we have an early morning tomorrow. Sheriff, I trust you will ensure that no more drunk men disturb the peace this evening." He did not wait for a response. His hand found Margot's arm, and he guided her toward the door with firm purpose, moving quickly, but not so fast as to seem like they were fleeing. Dignity mattered. Appearance mattered. If they ran, it would confirm every suspicion. As they passed Clara Whitmore, the woman reached out and touched Margot's hand briefly, the contact lasting only a second, but heavy with meaning. "We should talk," she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the resuming music. "Tomorrow, the schoolhouse. Come alone if you can." Then they were outside in the cold night air, the temperature shocking after the warmth of the crowded hall. Caleb helped Margot into the wagon with hands that trembled slightly, the only outward sign of how shaken he was. He climbed up beside her and took the reins, urging the horses into motion with more force than necessary. Neither of them spoke until they were well away from town, alone on the dark road with only starlight and a crescent moon to guide them. The frozen landscape stretched out on all sides, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "That woman who vouched for you," Caleb said finally, his voice low and tight. "You have never met her before tonight, have you?" "Never," Margot replied. "I have no idea who she is or why she helped us, but she saved us back there. Without her testimony, Harrington would have arrested me on the spot. The crowd would have demanded it. The question is why?" Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. "What does she want? What does she know? And how did she know to be there tonight?" "We will find out tomorrow. But tonight we need to prepare for what comes next. Those men know I am here now." The drunk revealing himself like that, it was not an accident. They are testing us, seeing how the town responds, measuring our defenses, looking for weaknesses. Caleb nodded grimly. "They will come for you soon. Maybe tonight. Maybe tomorrow. But they will come, and next time they will not bother with questions or witnesses." He glanced at her, his profile sharp in the moonlight. "I need you to promise me something. Anything. If it comes down to it, if there is no other choice, you run, you take Thunder, and you ride for the railroad. You get on a train, and you go as far as money will take you. Canada, maybe. Somewhere they cannot follow." "No," Margot's voice was firm. "I will not leave you and Lily to face this alone. I brought this danger to your door. I will not abandon you when it arrives. You might not have a choice. Then we make sure I do." When they reached Ironwood Ranch, they found Ida and Lily waiting anxiously by the fire in the parlor. Lily had tried to stay awake, fighting sleep with the determination only a child could muster, but she had lost the battle. She was curled up in Ida's lap, her blonde hair spread across the older woman's chest, her thumb in her mouth. But the moment she heard the door open, her eyes flew open. She scrambled down from Ida's lap and ran across the room, throwing herself at Margot with surprising force. "I was scared," the child whispered, her arms wrapping tight around Margot's waist, her small body trembling. "I dreamed something bad happened. I dreamed you did not come back." Margot knelt down to Lily's level, holding her close, breathing in the clean scent of the child's hair. "We are fine, sweetheart. Your papa kept us safe, just like he always does. Nothing is going to happen to us." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, as she stroked Lily's hair and felt the child's heartbeat slow from frantic to calm, Margot saw Caleb and Ida exchanging meaningful looks over her head. They both understood what she was coming to realize herself. The time for hiding, for pretending, for hoping they could avoid confrontation was over. The storm was coming, and they needed to be ready. That night, after Lily had finally been persuaded to go back to bed, After Ida had checked all the locks and windows and retired to her own room with a rifle propped beside her door, Caleb called an informal council of war in the kitchen. The three of them sat around the scarred wooden table, the only light coming from a single oil lamp that cast dancing shadows on the walls. "They will come for her soon," Caleb said without preamble, his voice low so it would not carry upstairs to where Lily slept. "Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow, but they will come, and they will not ask nicely this time. We need to decide what we are going to do, how we are going to protect her, how we are going to protect Lily, how we are going to protect everything we have built here." "We fight," Ida said simply, her dark eyes hard as flint. "This is our home. That girl upstairs is under our protection. Whether by law or by love does not matter. And we do not surrender what is ours to men who have no claim." Caleb nodded slowly. "I agree, but fighting means blood. It means possibly killing men or being killed ourselves. It means putting Lily in danger. It means risking everything I have spent 4 years building. I need to know that is a choice we are all prepared to make." He looked at Margot, his eyes searching her face for doubt or hesitation. "You could still run. I could put you on a train tonight, give you money, send you to California or Oregon or somewhere they would never think to look. You could disappear, start over somewhere new, save yourself." Margot shook her head firmly. "I am done running, Caleb. I ran from Boston. I ran to Wyoming. I have been running my entire life from one thing or another, and I am tired. More than that, I will not let you and Lily pay the price for protecting me. There has to be another way. A way to end this that does not involve waiting here like sheep for the wolves." "There is," Ida said, her voice thoughtful. "We do not wait for them to come here and threaten this child. We do not sit behind locked doors hoping they give up. We take the fight to them. We go to where they are weak instead of where they are strong." "Which is where?" Caleb asked. "In the light of day, in front of witnesses, in town, where they cannot act without consequences. We expose them for what they are. We turn the community against them. We make it impossible for them to operate." Margot leaned forward, understanding beginning to dawn. The woman at the dance, Clara Whitmore. She knows something. She has information. That is why she helped us. She is not just a random good Samaritan. "Exactly," Ida said. "That woman showed up in this town at exactly the right time, said exactly the right things, and now wants to meet with you alone. That is not coincidence. That is purpose. She has an agenda. The question is whether her agenda aligns with ours." "Only one way to find out," Caleb said. "Tomorrow we go talk to her, but carefully, prepared for treachery. Because if this is a trap, if she is working with the Blackwells, we need to be ready." Morning came too quickly, bringing with it a sky heavy with the promise of snow. The air had that peculiar quality it got before a storm, thick and hushed and waiting. Caleb hitched up the wagon while Margot made ready to return to town, this time with a specific purpose and a growing sense that everything was about to change. They left Lily in Ida's capable hands, the older woman armed with a shotgun and strict instructions to lock all the doors, to trust no one who came to the door, and to fire a warning shot if anyone tried to force their way inside. The ride to Cheyenne was tense and silent, both of them scanning the horizon for riders, for threats, for any sign that they were being watched or followed. But the plains were empty, the landscape white and pristine and deceptively peaceful. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a simple one-room structure with a steeply pitched roof and windows that faced east to catch the morning light. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the windows they could see movement inside. Caleb stopped the wagon 100 yards away. "I am going to circle around back, make sure there are no horses hidden, no men waiting. You wait here. If I signal danger, you drive straight back home. No hesitation. No argument. Understood. Understood." He disappeared around the building, moving with the practiced silence of a man who had scouted enemy positions in wartime. Margot waited, her hands tight on the reins, every nerve alert. But within minutes, Caleb reappeared and gave the all-clear signal. They approached together, Clara Whitmore was waiting inside, sweeping the floor in preparation for Monday's classes. She looked up as they entered, and her expression was grave but not hostile. She set the broom aside and gestured to the student benches. "Please, sit. We do not have much time, and there is a great deal I need to explain." They sat on benches designed for children, feeling absurd and vulnerable and uncertain. Clara pulled a chair close and leaned forward, her dark eyes moving between them, assessing their readiness to hear what she had to say. "My name is Clara Whitmore, and that part is true, but I am not just a school teacher. I work for the Boston Herald as an investigative journalist. I have been following the Blackwell case for more than 2 years." Margot's breath caught in her throat. "You know about them, about what they have done, about my father." "I know everything, Mrs. Morrison. Or should I call you Miss Bennett?" Clara's voice was gentle but direct. "I know about your father's debts. I know about the mine in Colorado. I know about Vincent Blackwell Sr.'s predatory lending practices. And I know that you have documents that could bring his entire empire crashing down." "Then why have you not published the story?" Caleb demanded, his tone suspicious, his body tense and ready for violence if this turned out to be a trap. "If you know everything, why have you not stopped them?" "Because I have had no proof," Clara said simply. "The Blackwells are careful. Every contract is written by lawyers who know exactly how to stay on the right side of the law, even when the spirit of what they are doing is criminal. I have interviewed victims, dozens of them, families destroyed by debt they could never escape. But they are all too terrified to go on the record. And without documents, without hard evidence, any story I write gets buried by Blackwell's political connections before it even reaches print." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. "But you have those documents, Mrs. Morrison, your father's ledgers, the forged contract claiming you as property to settle debt. Those papers are exactly what I need to destroy them, not just Vincent Jr., but the entire corrupt organization." "How do we know you are who you say you are?" Caleb asked, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. "How do we know this is not just another way to get those documents?" Clara pulled a folded newspaper from her bag and handed it to him. It was an old edition of the Boston Herald, dated 6 months earlier. She pointed to a byline on the front page. "That is me, Clara Whitmore. I write under my real name because I want people I expose to know exactly who is coming for them." Margot took the newspaper and read the article carefully. It was about financial crimes in Boston's banking district, thoroughly researched and well written, stopping just short of naming the Blackwells directly, but making it clear who the targets were. "Why did you come all the way to Wyoming?" Margot asked softly. "Because I heard rumors that Thomas Bennett's daughter had fled west. Because I knew that if I could find you and gain your trust, I might finally have the evidence I need to finish what I started. And because," Clara added, her voice dropping lower, "I have seen what the Blackwells do to people. I have interviewed widows who lost everything. I have spoken to families torn apart, children left with nothing. If I can stop them, I have to try. It is not just a story to me anymore. It is personal." The three of them sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the wind rattling the schoolhouse windows. Then Margot made her decision. "The documents are at the ranch, hidden where no one would think to look. If you can promise me that publishing this story will truly stop the Blackwells, will keep them from coming after me or my family ever again, then I will give them to you." Clara's face lit up with fierce satisfaction. "It will stop them. I promise you that. But we need to move quickly. Those men who are looking for you work for Vincent Jr. If they find the documents first and destroy them, everything is lost. All your father's work, all the evidence, gone." "Then we go now," Caleb said, standing decisively. "We get the papers, we make copies, and we send them to every newspaper from here to Boston. We make so much noise that they cannot silence it all." They were halfway to the wagon when the first shot rang out. The bullet hit the schoolhouse wall inches from Caleb's head, sending splinters of wood exploding outward. He reacted with the instincts of a veteran, shoving both women to the ground and drawing his revolver in one fluid motion that spoke of muscle memory and training. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice hard and controlled. More shots followed, coming from multiple directions, the reports echoing across the frozen landscape. Through the wagon wheels, Margot could see riders circling the schoolhouse. 6 or 7 of them, all armed with rifles, all firing with deadly intent. This was not a warning. This was an execution. Caleb returned fire with the precision of a man who had learned to shoot in wartime, when hesitation meant death, and every bullet counted. His first shot took down one of the riders, the man tumbling backward off his horse with a scream that cut through the cold air. His second caught another in the shoulder, spinning the attacker around and sending his rifle clattering to the frozen ground. But there were too many of them, and they had position and numbers on their side. Bullets peppered the schoolhouse wall, shattered windows, kicked up frozen dirt around the wagon. The horses screamed and tried to bolt, but Caleb had tied them securely before entering the building. "We need to get inside," Clara shouted over the gunfire, her voice remarkably steady for someone who had just been thrust into a battle. "The schoolhouse walls are thick. We can hold them off until help comes." "What help?" Margot shouted back, pressing herself flat against the ground as bullets whistled overhead. "There is nobody else here. We are alone." But even as she spoke, she heard new sounds cutting through the chaos, more horses approaching fast from the direction of town. And then gunfire from a different angle, aimed at the attackers rather than at them. Sheriff Harrington appeared like an avenging angel, leading a group of armed townsmen, their faces grim with purpose. Despite all her suspicions of the man, despite the uncomfortable questions he had asked at the dance, Margot had never been so grateful to see anyone in her entire life. The sheriff's men engaged the Blackwell riders with fierce determination. The battle that followed was brief but brutal. 2 more attackers fell, their blood staining the pristine snow. The others, recognizing that they were now outnumbered and outflanked, wheeled their horses and fled toward the open plains, leaving their dead and wounded behind. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was almost painful. Margot's ears rang from the explosions. Her hands shook with adrenaline. She realized she was breathing in short, sharp gasps, her body flooded with chemicals it did not know how to process. Caleb's hand found hers, steady and warm, anchoring her to reality. "You are all right. We are all right. Just breathe." Harrington dismounted and walked toward them, his face darker than a thundercloud. His boots crunched on spent shell casings and frozen ground. When he reached them, he holstered his weapon with deliberate slowness. "You folks want to tell me what the hell that was about," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Because I am getting damn tired of people shooting up my town. First the drunk at the dance, now this. 7 armed men trying to kill a schoolteacher and a rancher's wife. I think it is time for some honest answers." Clara stood brushing snow and dirt from her dress with remarkable composure for someone who had just survived a gunfight. "Sheriff, I think it is time we had a frank conversation. About Boston, about the Blackwells, and about why Mrs. Morrison is really here." Over the next hour, sitting in Harrington's office with guards posted outside and the wounded attackers locked in cells, they told him everything. Every detail, every secret. There was no point in holding back anymore. The violence had forced their hand. Margot produced the wooden box she had retrieved from the ranch that morning, her hands trembling slightly as she unlocked it. Inside were her father's ledgers, meticulous records spanning 5 years, every loan documented, every interest payment tracked, every illegal rate calculated, every threat made when payments were late, and, most damning of all, the forged contract, a document claiming to sell Margot herself to Vincent Blackwell, Jr. as settlement for her father's debts, signed with her father's name in a hand that was close but not quite right. A forgery that would never hold up in any legitimate court, but had been designed to intimidate and control. Clara explained her investigation, her years of chasing the story, her frustration at having witnesses too terrified to speak, and evidence always just out of reach. She showed Harrington her credentials, her published articles, her notes documenting dozens of Blackwell victims across Massachusetts and beyond. Caleb vouched for Margot's character, explained how she had come to Wyoming seeking safety, and made clear his intention to protect her at any cost. His voice was calm, but left no room for doubt about where he stood. Harrington listened to it all in silence, his weathered face unreadable. He examined the ledgers with careful attention, running his finger down columns of numbers, pausing at entries that were particularly egregious. When they finished their explanations, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "I ought to arrest you, Mrs. Morrison," he said finally. "Or Miss Bennett, I suppose. You came here under false pretenses. You married Morrison under what amounts to fraudulent circumstances. You are being pursued by dangerous men who just brought deadly violence to my town. 3 men are dead out there. Good men from Cheyenne who answered my call and risked their lives. You put innocent people in harm's way." Margot felt her heart sink. After everything, after surviving the attack, was she going to end up in a cell anyway? But then Harrington continued, and his tone had shifted subtly. "But I am not going to do that. You know why? Because I have seen men like the Blackwells before. During my time in Denver, I worked cases involving moneylenders and loan sharks. I saw what they do. I saw families destroyed by debt they could never escape. Debts that grew faster than any honest person could pay. I saw good men driven to suicide rather than watch their wives and children suffer. I saw women forced into degradation to satisfy payments. And I saw those lenders get away with it, time and time again, protected by lawyers and judges they owned." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the town he had sworn to protect. "If what Miss Whitmore says is true, if these documents can stop the Blackwells from destroying more lives, then I am going to help you. Not because I enjoy being lied to, not because I approve of deception, but because sometimes the law is not enough. Sometimes justice requires people brave enough to stand up and fight, even when the odds are stacked against them." He turned back to face them, his decision made. "Here is what we are going to do. Miss Whitmore, you are going to take these ledgers, and you are going to make copies, multiple copies, as many as we can manage. Then you are going to send them to every newspaper between here and Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, San Francisco. We are going to make so much noise that the Blackwells cannot silence it all." "And while she does that," Caleb asked, "while she does that, you and your wife are going to go home and prepare for what comes next. Because when the Blackwells realize what is happening, when they see their empire crumbling in the pages of every major newspaper, they are going to send more men, better men, professional killers who will not make the same mistakes as these amateurs. And next time I might not arrive in time to save you." "How long do we have?" Margot asked. "Days, maybe. A week at most." Harrington's expression was grim. "The men we captured, they will talk eventually. They will send word back to Boston about what happened here, and the Blackwells will respond with overwhelming force." "Then we use that time wisely," Clara said, already gathering the documents. "I can have copies made by tomorrow evening. I have contacts at the telegraph office who can send priority messages to my editor in Boston and to colleagues at other papers. Within 3 days, this story will be front-page news in a dozen cities." "And what happens to us after that?" Margot asked quietly. "Even if the Blackwells are ruined, even if they go to prison, their associates will still want revenge. We will be looking over our shoulders for the rest of our lives." "Maybe," Harrington conceded. "Or maybe, if we do this right, if we expose them completely and publicly, you become too visible to touch. Dead martyrs make better stories than living witnesses. The Blackwells are criminals, but they are not stupid. If killing you would only generate more attention and more investigation, they might decide you are more trouble than you are worth." It was a slim hope, but it was hope nonetheless. That night, back at Ironwood Ranch, Caleb did something he had not done since Sarah's death. He went into the bedroom that had belonged to his first wife, the room he had kept sealed like a shrine for 2 years, and he began to pack away her things, not with sadness, though there was some of that, an echo of old grief that would probably never completely fade, but mostly with a kind of gentle respect and a recognition that it was time. Time to let go, time to make room for the living instead of preserving space for ghosts. Margot found him there, folding Sarah's dresses into a trunk with careful hands, treating each garment with the reverence it deserved. "I am not trying to erase her," he said without turning around, as if he had sensed Margot's presence. "Lily will always have her mother's memory. I will make sure of that. But this house needs to be for the living now, for the family we are building together, for whatever future we can carve out of this mess." Margot walked into the room, crossing the threshold of what had been forbidden territory for the past 2 months. She picked up a photograph from the dresser, a wedding portrait of Caleb and Sarah, both of them young and happy and full of hope for a future that had been cut tragically short. "She was beautiful," Margot said softly, studying the woman's face. "And she loved you very much. I can see it in her eyes." "She was," Caleb agreed. He took the photograph, studied it for a moment with an expression Margot could not quite read, then carefully wrapped it in cloth and placed it in the trunk. "But she is gone. And you are here. And somewhere along the way, without me quite noticing when it happened, this stopped being just a practical arrangement for me." Margot's heart began to beat faster. "What are you saying?" He finally turned to look at her directly, and his eyes held something she had not seen there before. Something that looked like vulnerability mixed with hope. "I am saying that I have watched you transform from a frightened woman who could not boil water without burning it into someone who stood calm under gunfire. I have watched you win my daughter's heart, which I did not think was possible. I have watched you face down death with more courage than most men I served with in the war. And I have realized something." "What?" "That Sarah would have liked you, would have approved of this, of us. She always said that life was for the living, that grief was natural, but should not become a prison. She made me promise before she died that I would not shut myself away forever, that I would find someone to share my life with, someone to help raise Lily, someone to grow old beside." He crossed the room to stand in front of Margot, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. "I am saying that this marriage started as protection and necessity, but it does not have to stay that way, if you are willing. If you want something more than just safety and a roof over your head." Margot looked into his eyes and saw everything she had been afraid to hope for. Respect, yes. Protection, certainly. But also the possibility of genuine partnership, of affection that might, given time and care, grow into something deeper, of a future that was chosen rather than forced. "I am willing," she whispered, "more than willing." He pulled her close then, not with urgency, but with tenderness, as if she were something precious he had thought lost forever. They stood together in the quiet room, holding each other while the wind howled outside, and the future waited, uncertain, but no longer frightening. Whatever came next, they would face it as partners, as husband and wife, not just in name, but in truth. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity and mounting tension. Clara worked tirelessly, copying documents by hand, enlisting the help of Cheyenne's telegraph operator to send encrypted messages to newspaper editors across the country. Word spread quietly through certain channels. Investigative journalists who had been waiting years for evidence against the Blackwells began to prepare their stories. At Ironwood Ranch, Caleb fortified their defenses. He brought in Luther Kane, a former cavalry scout who worked at a neighboring spread, to help guard the property. Luther was a hard man in his 50s, weathered by years on the frontier, with eyes that missed nothing and a reputation for being deadly with both rifle and knife. He took one look at the situation and nodded his understanding. "I have known men like these Blackwells," he said, checking his weapons with the care of a professional. Men who think money and power put them above common decency. I will be honored to help you teach them otherwise. Ida turned the ranch house into a fortress. She stockpiled food and water, prepared medical supplies in case of wounds, and showed Margot where every weapon was hidden. The older woman had lived through slavery and war and the brutal early days of Reconstruction. She was not easily frightened, but she understood the gravity of their situation. Lily sensed the tension, though the adults tried to shield her from the worst of it. The little girl stayed close to Margot, following her from room to room, her small hand often reaching out to touch her stepmother's dress, as if to confirm she was still there. "Are the bad men coming?" she asked one evening as Margot tucked her into bed. Margot could have lied. Should have lied, perhaps, to spare the child's innocence. But she remembered what Lily had said weeks ago about hating when adults treated her like a baby. So instead, she told a version of the truth. "Some people are angry with me because of something my father did. They might try to cause trouble, but your papa and Ida and some friends are making sure we stay safe. And I promise you, sweetheart, I will never let anything bad happen to you." Lily studied her face with those solemn brown eyes. "I am glad you came here, even if it brought bad men. Because now Papa smiles again, and I have a mama again, and that is worth fighting for." The simple declaration made Margot's throat tight with emotion. She kissed Lily's forehead and whispered, "You are worth fighting for. Never forget that." On the fourth day, a rider arrived from town. It was one of Harrington's deputies, a young man named Tom, who looked barely old enough to shave. He carried a telegram and a newspaper, both of which he handed to Caleb with trembling hands. "The sheriff said you would want to see these right away." The telegram was from Clara. It contained only 4 words: "Stories run tomorrow morning." The newspaper was the Boston Herald, advance copy sent by special courier. The headline screamed across the front page in letters 2 inches high. "Blackwell Empire, built on fraud and extortion. Exclusive documents reveal years of predatory lending." Below it, Clara's byline. Below that, 3 full pages of detailed reporting backed by irrefutable evidence from Thomas Bennett's ledgers. Names, dates, amounts, everything documented with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. Margot read it twice, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face. Her father's final act, the records he had kept even as they destroyed him, would now destroy the men who had killed him. It was vindication. It was justice. It was closure she had not known she needed. By tomorrow this time, similar stories will be running in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago. Clara's accompanying note read, "Federal marshals are already preparing warrants. The Blackwells are finished." But in the same packet was another message, this one from Harrington, more ominous. "Riders spotted heading your direction, at least 10 men. Well armed, professional killers by the look of them. They will reach you by nightfall, bringing reinforcements, but may not arrive in time. Hold the line." Caleb read the message aloud to the assembled household. Luther checked his ammunition. Ida loaded the shotgun she kept by the kitchen door. Margot felt ice forming in her stomach, but forced herself to remain calm. Lily was watching. The child needed to see strength, not fear. "What do we do?" Margot asked. "We fight, his fumfie," Caleb said simply. "We have good walls, good weapons, and good people. They will have numbers and probably better training, but we have something they do not." "What is that?" "We fight for those we love. They are mercenaries chasing gold. We are defending our daughter, our home, our future. That is an advantage no amount of training can overcome." As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered plains in shades of blood orange and deep purple, they took their positions. Luther and Caleb stationed themselves at windows on opposite sides of the house, rifles ready. Ida positioned herself in the kitchen, with clear sight lines to the back door. Margot, despite never having imagined herself in such a situation, took up position in the upstairs hallway with a loaded revolver. Lily was in the root cellar, hidden beneath blankets with strict instructions to stay silent no matter what she heard. It had been the hardest thing Margot had ever done, leaving that frightened child alone in the dark. But it was also the safest place on the property, thick walls and earth providing protection from stray bullets. They waited as darkness deepened, and the night sky revealed itself, vast and cold, and indifferent to human struggle. Waited as temperature dropped and their breath-formed clouds in the unheated rooms. Waited as minutes stretched into hours and tension coiled tighter with each passing moment. Then Luther's voice, low and urgent, riders, coming from the east, moving slow and careful. Margot moved to the window and saw them. 10 men on horseback, spread out in a wide line, approaching with the patience of professionals who knew their business. These were not the amateur thugs who had attacked the schoolhouse. These were killers, trained and experienced and very dangerous. The leader, riding slightly ahead of the others, raised his hand, and the line stopped just out of rifle range. He was a big man, broad-shouldered even in his heavy coat, and something about the way he sat, his horse spoke of military training. "Morrison," the man called out, his voice carrying clearly in the cold night air. "My name is Colonel Paxton. I have been hired to retrieve certain property belonging to the Blackwell family. Send out the woman and the documents she stole, and we will leave peacefully. You have my word as an officer and a gentleman." "Your word means nothing," Caleb shouted back. "Those documents are already in the hands of newspapers across the country. Your employers are finished. Go home, Colonel." "There is nothing for you here." A pause. Then Paxton's voice again, colder this time. "Then we do this the hard way. I am giving you 1 hour to reconsider. After that, we come in, and I cannot guarantee anyone's safety once the shooting starts." "Come ahead," Caleb responded. "But understand this. I am a veteran of the 5th Cavalry. The man with me served as a scout in Apache country. The woman upstairs shoots better than half the men in this territory. And we are protecting our family. You want a war, Colonel? We will give you one you will not forget." The hour that followed was the longest of Margot's life. She could see the riders through the window, dark shapes moving in the starlight, repositioning themselves, planning their attack. Her hands were slick with sweat despite the cold. Her heart hammered so hard she thought they might hear it outside. Then, with no warning, it began. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions simultaneously, a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm their defenses. Bullets shattered windows, punched through wooden walls, kicked up splinters and dust. The noise was deafening, continuous, like being inside a thunderstorm made of lead and powder smoke. Caleb returned fire with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed. Luther did the same from the other side of the house, his rifle barking steadily. Ida's shotgun boomed from the kitchen, the distinctive sound cutting through the chaos. Margot waited for a clear target, remembered everything Caleb had taught her about breathing and aim and patience. When one of the attackers broke from cover and ran toward the house, she squeezed the trigger. The man stumbled and fell, whether from her bullet or someone else's, she could not tell. But he did not get back up. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The attackers were skilled, using suppressing fire and movement to advance toward the house. But Caleb and Luther were better positioned and more motivated. 2 more attackers fell. Then a third. Then Margot heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps on the porch below, the sound of wood splintering as someone forced the front door. They had gotten inside. She moved to the top of the stairs, revolver raised, and saw a dark figure in the entryway. She fired without hesitation. The man went down, but another was right behind him. And another. Caleb appeared from the parlor, his rifle empty, drawing his pistol. He and Margot fought side by side at the top of the stairs, father and wife united in desperate defense of home and family. Just when it seemed they might be overwhelmed, new sounds cut through the gunfire. Horses approaching at full gallop, fresh gunfire from behind the attackers, shouts of confusion and alarm from Colonel Paxton's men. Sheriff Harrington had arrived with 20 armed men from Cheyenne. The townspeople, galvanized by Clara's story and angry at the violence brought to their community, had come to defend one of their own. The battle turned instantly. Caught between the house and Harrington's force, Paxton's men found themselves outflanked and outgunned. Some tried to surrender, others tried to run and were cut down. Within minutes, it was over. Colonel Paxton himself lay dead on the frozen ground, killed by a bullet from Luther's rifle. The few surviving attackers were being rounded up by Harrington's men, their hands bound, their weapons confiscated. Caleb pulled Margot into his arms, both of them shaking with adrenaline and relief. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other amid the gun smoke and shattered glass and the aftermath of violence. Then Margot remembered. Lily. She broke from Caleb's embrace and ran for the root cellar, her heart in her throat. "Please," she prayed, "please let her be all right. Please let her be safe." The cellar door opened, and a small blonde head emerged, eyes wide with fear, but body unharmed. Lily saw Margot and launched herself forward, her small arms wrapping around her stepmother's waist with crushing force. "I was so scared," the child sobbed. "I heard the guns and I thought, we are safe, sweetheart. We are all safe. The bad men are gone, I promise." That night, after the bodies had been removed and the wounded tended to and statements given to the sheriff, after Harrington had assured them that federal marshals were already moving to arrest both Vincent Blackwell Sr. and Jr. in Boston, after Luther had been thanked and offered a permanent position at the ranch which he accepted, after everything had finally quieted, the Morrison family gathered in the parlor. Caleb held Lily on his lap, the little girl finally sleeping after hours of clinging to both her father and Margot. Ida sat in her rocking chair, the shotgun finally set aside, her weathered face peaceful. Margot curled up beside Caleb on the sofa, her head on his shoulder. Exhaustion pulling at her. "It is over," Caleb said softly. "Truly over." "Not quite," Margot replied. "There will be trials, testimony, questions. The story is not finished yet, but the dangerous part is, and that is enough for now." In the weeks and months that followed, the Blackwell empire crumbled exactly as Clara had predicted. Vincent Blackwell Sr. was arrested and charged with fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. His trial lasted 3 weeks and ended with a conviction and a sentence of 15 years in federal prison. He died there 2 years later, broken and forgotten. Vincent Blackwell Jr. fled to San Francisco to escape prosecution, but was eventually found and arrested. He received a lighter sentence in exchange for testifying against his father's business associates, but his reputation was destroyed. He died in 1888 in a boarding house, drunk and alone, mourned by no one. The silver mine in Colorado that Thomas Bennett had left to his daughter proved even more valuable than initial estimates suggested. Margot sold 60% of her stake to a reputable mining company, but retained 40% for ongoing dividends. The initial payment was $80,000, an enormous sum that transformed the Morrison family's future. With that money, Caleb expanded Ironwood Ranch significantly. He purchased the adjacent property, doubling their holdings. He built new barns and corrals. He bought additional cattle and horses. Within 5 years, Bennett Morrison Cattle Company, named to honor both families, became one of the most successful ranching operations in Wyoming Territory. Clara Whitmore won a prestigious journalism award for her Blackwell exposé. She was offered positions at major newspapers in New York and Chicago, but declined them all, choosing instead to remain in Cheyenne. She eventually married Luther Kane in a ceremony attended by the entire town. They had 2 children together and lived a long, happy life. Sheriff Harrington became something of a legend, the lawman who had stood up to Eastern criminals and protected his community. He served as sheriff for another 20 years before retiring. He and Caleb became close friends, often sitting together on the Morrison porch, smoking cigars and talking about everything and nothing. Lily grew from a frightened 5-year-old into a confident young woman. She attended boarding school in Denver, but always returned to the ranch during summers and holidays. She never forgot her birth mother, but came to love Margot just as deeply, calling her Mama without hesitation or qualification. Margot and Caleb had 2 more children together. Samuel was born in 1883, a sturdy boy with his father's dark coloring and his mother's quick mind. Rose arrived 2 years later, a cheerful child who seemed to find joy in everything. The ranch became a place of gathering and celebration. Every Christmas, the Morrison home filled with neighbors and friends, with music and laughter, and the kind of warmth that comes from shared history and mutual respect. Every summer, there were barn dances and cattle drives and long evenings on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. 10 years after that terrible winter night, when professional killers had come to Ironwood Ranch, Margot stood on the same porch where she had first arrived as a frightened stranger. She was 36 now, her auburn hair touched with gray at the temples, her hands calloused from work, her face showing the lines of someone who had lived fully and faced hardship without breaking. Caleb came to stand beside her, his arm sliding around her waist with the easy familiarity of long marriage. In the yard below, their children played with several neighbor children. Lily, now 15 and visiting from school, supervised the younger ones with patient authority. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Coming here, everything that happened?" Margot leaned into his warmth and considered the question seriously. She thought about her father and the pain of losing him. She thought about the fear and violence and the desperate fight for survival. She thought about how close they had all come to death that winter night. But she also thought about the family she had gained, the children, the community, the partnership with a man who saw her as an equal rather than property, the freedom to build something of her own choosing rather than accepting what others dictated. "Not for a moment," she said. "I came here as a mail-order bride running for her life. I found a family that cannot be taken from me. I found purpose and partnership and love. That is worth any price." Below them, Rose tumbled in the snow and came up laughing. Samuel helped his little sister to her feet with exaggerated gallantry. Lily called them all inside for hot chocolate, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Caleb pulled Margot closer. "I wrote a letter once," he said, "to a catalog bride service, asked for someone practical and sturdy who could help run a ranch. Instead, I got you." Disappointed, Margot asked with a smile. He kissed her temple. "Best mistake I ever made." That evening, after the children were in bed and the house had settled into quiet, Margot took out pen and paper. She wrote a letter to her only surviving relative, a distant cousin in Boston she had not contacted in years. The cousin had written months ago, curious about what had happened to Thomas Bennett's daughter, wondering if the scandalous stories were true. Margot wrote honestly, about fleeing Boston, about the catalog bride deception, about Caleb and Lily and the life she had built in Wyoming, about the Blackwell's destruction and the vindication of her father's memory. And she wrote about what she had learned. "I came to Wyoming believing I had lost everything," she wrote in careful script. "My father, my home, my place in society, my future. But I learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. I learned that family is not just blood but choice, that love can grow in the most unexpected places, that courage is not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it." She paused, considering how to end the letter. Then she wrote the final paragraph. "The West is a hard place that does not forgive weakness, but it also does not care about your past, only about who you prove yourself to be in the present. I came here as Margot Bennett, a frightened woman with no prospects. I became Margot Morrison, wife and mother and businesswoman, and survivor. And I would not trade that transformation for all the society balls and elegant dinners Boston could offer. She signed it, sealed it, and set it aside to mail in the morning. Outside, the Wyoming wind howled across the plains, carrying with it the promise of spring and renewal. Inside Ironwood Ranch, the Morrison family slept peacefully, protected by thick walls and locked doors, and the knowledge that they had faced the worst and emerged stronger. Margot stood at the window for a moment before joining Caleb in bed, looking out at the land they had fought to protect. She thought about that desperate girl who had stepped off the train in Cheyenne 2 years ago, terrified and alone, and certain she was making a terrible mistake. She wished she could go back and tell that girl what awaited her, the hardship, yes, but also the joy, the danger certainly, but also the triumph, the loss of one life, but the gaining of something infinitely more precious. But perhaps it was better not to know. Perhaps the journey was only meaningful because she had made each choice without knowing how the story would end. Perhaps courage only counted when the outcome was uncertain. She climbed into bed beside her husband, fitting herself against the warmth of him, feeling his arm come around her in sleep. The truth settled over her like a warm quilt. The greatest transformations were born from impossible choices. From the ashes of her Boston life, she had built something enduring. Frozen hope had become the fire that burned away pretense and left only what was real. She had been beaten down but not broken, left for dead but determined to live. And in the end, she had not just survived, but thrived, building from the ruins of her old life something better and stronger and entirely her own. That was her story. That was her triumph. That was the legacy she would leave her children and their children after them. And as she drifted toward sleep in the Wyoming darkness, safe and warm and surrounded by love, Margot Adelaide Morrison smiled, the mail-order bride who had defied fate and won. The end.